Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Commander Pod, your Magic the Gathering podcast for all things Commander. My name is Kelton Howell.
And I'm Spencer Simpson. If you've been following us at all for the past little while, you know that we've been working on a Commander power levels system because we have very little faith in the 1 to 10 power scale and how well that's helping people, as evidenced by the last 2 weeks of that's been happening in the Commander community.
I think everybody is seeing that breakdown. I mean, everybody knew it was broken, but now we're seeing the results of it being broken.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're very excited this week to announce CommanderPowerLevels.com, which is a resource and that includes guidelines around that system that we've been working on.
Yeah, we're super excited. It's really meant to be a resource to help document our power level system, provide a place to learn more about it, and then just hopefully help people have better power level and Rule Zero conversations.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about that quite a bit today, and hopefully you get a good taste for what's going to be in that document. And we're going to give you a little TLDR here, which is that our system is trying to be a deck building centric approach to power levels because we believe that it's every player's responsibility to be introspective about the power levels of their decks when they first start building, rather than taking a deck they built to a table and saying, I don't know, it's a 7, and then trying to play with everyone else.
Totally. And if you're a longtime follower of the channel, you'll have heard a lot of this stuff before, but this is really the culmination of everything that we have been talking about for the last 8 months or so, all packaged into one neat little thing. So listen to it, enjoy it, share it with your friends, and let's spread some more good power level
vibes, love, good power level Rule Zero discussion, love, and vibes. And I think what prompted us to we've been working on this for a little while, but what prompted us to rush this out, not really rush it out the door, but at least get it done because
but pull a couple of long nights and working on this,
was WotC announcing that they're working on a pretty similar resource that will be including a system that will likely replace this one. So this is likely going to be a pretty short-lived system, but we felt like it was good to push it out, both to get our thoughts documented about it, but also try to get it hopefully in front of some eyes at WotC, because they are looking for feedback from the community on the solution they're eventually going to implement.
So feel free to send this to Gavin.
Yeah. Everyone just light up Gavin's DMs with this video.
We'll also make sure to update this to fit in with whatever Wizards does create and release. We'll make sure that this website remains a living document to document whatever the best practices are for deck building and power levels at the given time and whatever the format looks like.
Yeah, that was the goal with it to begin with, was to have it be a living document and change as we got feedback or as our perspectives changed and we were further educated in how to have better Rule Zero conversations. And now this will be just reflecting how to do that and how to tackle that in deck building, potentially in the WotC system, if that does come to fruition.
Sure. Whatever that ends up looking like. But before we jump into it, let's talk about why we even did this. As Spencer alluded to before, we are primarily motivated by the fact that it felt nearly impossible to have productive Rule Zero and power level discussions with the existing 1 to 10 scale. It's just too big, right? 1 to 10 is too large of a scale.
Yeah, I mean, as we were talking about how big and ineffective that scale actually is, one thing that you had mentioned is that that's a reason people don't use 1 to 10 scales on any sort of survey gathering or anything like that, trying to data gather, because things tend to clump at 7, right? Is what people have noticed in like data gathering. And so if it's a scale that's a very qualitative value, like the power of your commander deck, that's hard to quantify, people will naturally also just clump towards 7, because that's like kind of between 5 and 10.
It's a little bit above midpoint, and we like that as humans. We like to put subjective things at that point. So that hence the meme. My deck is a 7.
Yeah. So what we ended up deciding to do was to narrow that down to a 5-point scale, because effectively people were only using 5 through 10 anyways. And so we thought, well, let's just cut off the first little bit. But we've really tried to keep it categorical rather than quantitative. So rather than 1 through 5, we've been trying to use low, mid, and high with 1 degree of separation. So low, low, mid, high mid, and high end up being our categories. And that might seem like an insignificant difference, But the idea is that this is a very qualitative discussion, and we're trying to take the quantifying out of it as much as possible, so that we can be more descriptive rather than quantitative about it.
Yeah, because seven doesn't mean anything, but at least you're trying to describe, hey, my deck is like a high mid power level deck. Right?
Yeah.
If you're using qualitative terms, you're at least trying to be descriptive of something. Whereas like a 1 to 10 point scale is purely just like, what do I think this number means? And that's what it means to me.
Yeah. And so, and the other thing we were trying to do with this was we're trying to address what we think is also the main problem of the 1 to 10 scale. And it's that there wasn't really a widely recognized tool set or especially point of reference. So it was impossible for people to qualify their decks into the right, I guess, category, which would have been a number from 1 to 10, successfully using the same metrics. And so what ends up happening is everyone shows up and says their deck's a 7, and everyone's technically right because from their perspective of having played in their pod or at their LGS, their deck is a 7, right? They're kind of the midpoint of the decks they've seen, but that might be on an objective scale like a 3 or a 9, right? Depending on what they've played against. So point being, we need something that everyone recognizes and agrees upon that is also useful.
Yeah, and will that be our power level system? Probably not. The good news is that like whatever Wizards puts out, that will be the de facto way to discuss power levels. So I think getting additional guidance is a good thing. It's just so important to get it right. And so if there's anything in here that's beneficial and can contribute to that conversation, like then we've reached our goal. That would be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had mentioned that it's a deck building centric system, and that's what we want to start talking about first. And one of the core tenets of this is that we believe that the power level discussion starts with each individual in the deck building process. So a lot of people build a deck is what is happening now, and then they'll take it to a play group, and then they'll try to figure out what power level it is. And often they'll just say it's a 7, and then either get corrected or don't, and then they believe it's a 7 forever. And what this leads to is just including cards or strategies that are inconsistent with the goals of a deck at any given power level. So if you're like, oh, I'm trying to build a chill deck, right? Yeah. And then you start including like really powerful cards, those will be power level outliers in the deck that will make the deck overperform at what you thought the power level would be sometimes.
Yeah, so we believe that a good deck is a deck that can consistently perform at a given power level. And it's not going to consistently outperform or, on the other side, have a large amount of non-games. That's the other side of this. So we recommend that instead of just like building a deck and then saying, I think it's this power level, we recommend picking a power level that you want to play at and then building a deck that suits that goal. And it's actually really helpful to do that. It actually helps you make those card choices as you're building the deck.
Yeah, and it is more difficult, right? It's inherently more difficult than just throwing a bunch of cards together. And we understand that not everyone wants to do that, but we really want to advocate for that to be done because it is worth it. It's worth it to be able to help curate a good play experience at a given power level with the people you're going to be playing with. Yeah. So part of this philosophy is that we have to rely on some assumptions, right? And we mentioned power level outliers as part of the deck building, and that's one of the first things we want to talk about. And those are cards that fall outside of your intended power level. So if we're being intentional about our deck building and we're building to a specific power level, I'm building a mid-power deck, or even a low-power deck. Let's say I'm building a low-power deck, and I decide that I want to put in Force of Will and Cyclonic Rift. Those would be power level outliers for that deck because it won't make the deck always perform at a higher power, but it will certainly make the deck sometimes perform significantly better than another deck at that power level would.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that it is extremely difficult to evaluate cards in a vacuum. So I think what does happen a lot of times is, I have a deck that I really like to play, and then I open a booster pack, and it's got a Force of Will in it. And I'm like, oh, that's such a cool card. Or someone tells me, hey, that card's really expensive. You know that card's really good, right? And I was like, oh, maybe I didn't know that card was really good. I'm like, I should put it in my deck. Or it's a cool card. I want to put it in my deck. And I throw it in my deck, and I may not have the experience to know what kind of play experience that card promotes and what that card is going to have. And so it becomes a power level outlier in my deck. So I do want to say that it is very difficult if you're not a relatively experienced player who has had the opportunity to play with a lot of different cards. It can be hard to evaluate cards in a vacuum.
Yeah, and this is the type of thing that you only really develop as you play, right? You play different cards, you play against different cards, you see how they affect the game. And I think it's easy to say, well, one card's not going to change the power level of your deck, which we believe in. We believe that one card doesn't change the power level of your deck, right? But I think it's pretty evidenced by the bans of Mana Crypt, Jewel Lotus, and Dockside Extortionist that one card can inconsistently make your deck perform significantly better than you've intended it to.
Yeah,
right? And so
I want to be careful not to say better. It performs significantly different than it was intended to.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, at a
Because
higher power level.
At a higher power level, because like once again, we believe that a good deck is a consistent deck. So a low power deck that consistently plays at a low power level, that's a great deck. We love that deck.
Yeah, thank you for that correction. That is a better way to think about it.
and this might also be a point for the WotC bracket system to help newer or less experienced players understand how powerful cards can be. So if they open up like a Force of Will, they can see, oh, this is a bracket 4 card. I'm not going to put it in my bracket 1 deck. That can be a shortcut to help newer players make those decisions if it's something that they haven't experienced before.
Yeah, because you get a lot of experienced players who are helping, hopefully, make those decisions on where the cards should go.
Yeah.
And
please
so
please help newer players, experienced players.
Yeah, absolutely. So just like we don't want decks to overperform, right? The other side of the coin is also true. We don't want decks to underperform inconsistently, right? Sometimes play at their intended power level and sometimes play significantly worse. And the way we remedy this is by eating our vegetables, right? You've probably heard this from other channels as well. Eating your vegetables means including the things that your deck needs at a given power level, right? To make sure that it's running at the desired power level. So
yes, those
go ahead.
Vegetables include Ramp, which are the cards that you play early in the game to accelerate your mana or your core game plan for the rest of the game. Interaction, which are the cards that protect your game plan and disrupt other people's game plans. Card Advantage, which allows you to see more cards and refill your hand. And then lands, because you need lands.
Because everybody
and
needs
you should
lands.
be playing enough lands.
Yeah, absolutely. And so our system will, part of having a good power levels discussion presupposes this, right? It's that people are building their decks appropriately and to a specific power level, but they're including the things they need to make it run, not just like putting a pile of cards together that they think might make it.
Yeah, that's what makes it run consistently and lets you actually do the thing. You're not going to get to do the thing if you don't have enough lands. You're not going to get to do the thing if you don't have enough interaction to protect your game plan, and so on and so forth for each of these vegetables. These are the core pieces of your deck that make it function and allow you to execute your strategy.
Yeah, and vegetables will look a little different at different power levels. So at lower power levels, your vegetables are going to be more thematic and relatively inefficient, right? Like still good, not necessarily bad by any means, but not the most efficient versions of them. Whereas at higher powers, they'll typically be like the most efficient version of that effect and may not even be very thematic at all because the goal is to perform very efficiently and usually
fast.
quickly and fast, if possible.
Yeah. So let's talk about each of those vegetables a little bit and talk about how they really relate to power level. The first one being ramp. And I think that in terms of ramp, the power level of your deck is going to primarily affect the quality of your ramp that you choose to play, and to a much lesser extent, the density of ramp that you're going to be playing.
Yeah, we have done a full episode on this. We're going to include a lot of the details on commanderpowerlevels.com. Be sure to go check it out there. But what we found is that the lowest amount of ramp you typically want to play in most decks is 10 pieces, and that on average you want to be playing around 13 to 16, but weighted towards 13. 13 is where you optimize your opportunity cost by not having to run 3 more pieces of ramp, while also maximizing your chances to see the amount of ramp you want to see in the early turns of the game. And the most you ever really want to run is 20 pieces of ramp. And that would be if you're playing a ramp themed deck or something, and you need Yeah,
I have
you need
I
this.
have several ramp themed decks, and they play about 20 pieces of ramp. You don't really want more than that. It's not going to do much.
Kelton's a hallmark Simic player, playing
Yes.
a lot of ramp themed
Yes,
decks.
but almost every one of my other decks plays about 13 pieces of ramp. That's
Yeah, the
just
density,
best
like
bang
you're
for
saying,
your buck.
yeah, it won't change that much between the power levels. The density is going to be about the same. The big thing that's going to change is the quality. So the speed and efficiency of your ramp are going to be the primary differentiators between power levels. So at low power, you're probably playing 2 to 3 ramp spell, or 2 to 3 mana cost ramp spells, and they're going to enter tapped. They may not fix colors. They may not enter tapped. They may enter untapped as well. But you're playing a mix of some of these less efficient and some of these more efficient, but generally between 2 to 3 mana, not some of the most efficient ones. You may not play rituals. Like Jessica's Will is included in some precons. People might be saying, like, aren't you going to play that in low power decks? But Jessica's Will would be an example of like a power level outlier in those decks.
In a precon.
Yeah, in a precon for sure.
Yeah, and then mid power decks are going to have mana that costs more in the 1 to 3 mana, or did I say mana? Ramp. Mid power decks are going to include ramp that may cost somewhere in like the 1 to 3 mana range. For the most part, they're always going to enter untapped, fix your colors very efficiently, and this is where you're going to see a lot more of the explosive ritual style effects.
Yeah, especially in decks where that's relevant. Some decks don't want those quite as much, but you will start to see those around here. And then high power decks are gonna be playing ramp that costs 0 to 2 mana, maybe not as much anymore because we've lost some of the really good versions of that. But they'll still play a lot of those your Chrome Mox and Mox Diamond or whatever. And then those are gonna enter untapped, fix colors efficiently, and put you again. I don't know about multiple turns ahead. That was kind of our previous philosophy about that. Now it's Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus are gone, and those are kind of the ones that were doing that. But they will
it still
be very
does, though.
efficient.
It still puts
it still
you
does.
multiple turns ahead.
For sure.
Especially with those like really explosive ritual spells like Jessica's Will.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the next category then that we want to chat about is card advantage. So the power level of your deck here primarily affects the type of card advantage that your deck's going to include.
Yep. The types of card advantage that we have listed here are smoothers, which leave you card neutral or maybe one card positive, but let you see more cards. So these would be things like cantrips or whatever, right? That are like letting
or like
you,
Night's Whisper.
like
it's
Night's
2
Whisper.
mana, draw 2 cards.
Yeah, exactly. They're not refilling your hand. That job is left for refillers, which will actually refill your hand, draw you 3 or 4 cards, and give you gas to continue playing the game. And then engines are going to be your most powerful draw effects. They will sit on board. They will draw you multiple cards, sometimes multiple cards a turn cycle, and just really give you a huge advantage over the course of the game.
Yeah, and in terms of density, most decks, once again, need to include at least 10 card advantage pieces. This is similar to ramp, and 13 to 16 should really be efficient. A little different than ramp, you really need a reason to want to play more than 16 pieces of card advantage. And that's a lot of times because card advantage grants more card advantage. So if you're running a lot of pieces, that's all you're going to be drawing into. And you're going to be drawing a lot of cards, which feels good, but you're also just drawing into more card advantage.
Yeah, you need to draw into gas. That's what we're trying to do. Yeah, and sometimes this can even change based on your commander as well. If you're playing a commander that grants you card advantage, not from the command zone. I don't know if there's eminence card advantage abilities.
Oh my gosh, that would be so gross.
Is
that kind of what Sidar Jabari does?
It does. It gives you card advantage. You draw and discard, you loot. It's crazy.
Yeah, that's wild.
But if your commander does give you card advantage, you always have access to your commander, so you'll be able to get your commander out, and maybe you can get away with running a little bit less. You'll notice that we're going to say at minimum 10, usually for both of these, and then 13 to 16 is kind of a sweet spot for a lot of this. That was, again, from our analysis, that's how you're most likely going to see 1 or 2 of these in the first couple turns of the game, which is when you're going to want them and then keep them in your hand or what have you. So the types of deck, like we said, the type of card advantage you're playing will change with power level. So low power decks are mostly going to be playing a combination of smoothers and refillers. They might play an engine, right? They might an engine or 2, but they won't be playing the best engines necessarily, right? They'll just that's typically how you're going to see them weighted. Whereas in a mid power deck, you'll still probably play some smoothers, especially if they're on theme, right? If you're playing like a cantrips deck, you'll play a lot of smoothers, but you're mostly playing refillers and engines at this point. And then at high power decks, you're playing engines, you're playing very explosive draw, you're playing things like Peer into the Abyss and Ad Nauseum if you're trying to win through those type of lines. Like you're just playing the best version of those effects.
Yeah, absolutely. let's move on to interaction. So the power level of your deck here actually does affect both the density and the quality of your interaction pieces. So this is where power levels, you see the most flux between different power levels.
Yeah, one thing we talked about is that it's mostly in vegetables quality that's going to affect your power levels, and interaction does kind of run the gamut of both quality and density affecting it. So in low power decks, we think 8 to 12 is pretty sufficient. That's historically been the wisdom, actually, too, is 8 to 12 pieces of interaction. That has started to feel like too little, especially as you move up in power levels.
In power level.
Yeah. So at a mid power level, we recommend it between 12 and 16. Again, similar range to what we've been saying for these other effects. This just ensures that you're seeing them. And in a mid-power game, you're going to need to see them. And you're going to see them even more in a high-power game, so we recommend somewhere between 16 and 20 pieces of interaction. Because you're going to need to be able to protect your win conditions and also stop other people from attempting to win at that point.
And you may notice that for each of these vegetables, we've only talked about low, mid, and high power decks. There is a degree of separation between each of those, so you can find the midpoint pretty easily for the types of effects or the quantity of effects you'd want to be running. So in terms of the quality of interaction, how that changes with power level, the quality really is indicative of the kinds of threats that you're going to encounter at that power level. So lower power decks may only need to include interaction that's slightly less efficient or narrow or sorcery speed, because that's the kinds of threats that you're going to be encountering in those games.
Yeah, and a mid-power deck is going to be running stuff that's more efficient, more flexible, and probably instant speed, because you're going to be seeing things that you need to remove as they hit the battlefield in a given turn cycle. And then when you move to high-power decks, you're playing a lot more counter spells. You're playing a lot more free spells, because you need to be able to generate your own advantage, but also stop people from attempting wins or whatever when it gets around to their turn.
Yeah.
You're just playing the best version of them.
Yeah, just all of the most efficient effects in the game at higher power. Yeah. So all of this comes together, and we eventually landed on our Commander deck building template, which is meant to provide a really good starting point for building a mid-power deck. And from there, you can make the changes that we mentioned for each of these vegetables to try and tune that deck to a lower or a higher power level.
Yes. So this template, again, is a guideline. Not every deck will look exactly like this, but it's a great starting point, especially for mid-power decks. And it's
it is agnostic of strategy, right?
Yes.
Like your strategy will dictate. It's when it dictates what your deck should look like.
Yes.
Yeah. But this is like agnostic of strategy. It's just purely based on the numbers of vegetables that you need to be running.
Yeah. So, and it looks like this. We have one commander, or two if you're playing a partner or a background, 36 lands. People may not agree with this. We have found that 36 is a really great number for not getting flooded and also not missing land drops.
I do hear 38 a lot, but after looking at the numbers and doing a pretty, I think, extensive and thorough analysis, I feel very comfortable running 36 lands, especially in a format where I get a free mulligan.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you get 3 in the first 3 turns, hopefully you're going to find a card advantage piece that will let you look for more cards. So speaking of card advantage, we run 13 card advantage. Like we were saying, 13 to 16 was kind of the range for all 3 of these. The opportunity cost of running 16 is sometimes not worth it. And so we think you want to err towards 13, and that's why it's 13. Same thing for interaction. 13 pieces of interaction, 13 pieces of ramp, and then 24 deck-specific cards, or 23 if you are playing a partner or background.
Yeah, so you may be thinking 24 is not very many cards to include for my deck. I've whittled my 100 card deck down to 24 cards. That's because these vegetables can also be on theme for your deck or in the strategy of what your deck is trying to accomplish. So you're going to have more than 24 cards that feel like your deck. You're going to try and find ways to incorporate pieces of card advantage, interaction, and ramp that fit within your theme as well.
Yeah, I play a zombie deck, and in my zombie deck, a lot of my interaction and a lot of my card advantage are zombies. Zombies don't ramp you, so I have to play kind of just generic ramp, right? That's available.
Rocks, yeah.
Right, rocks. But everything else is trying to be relatively thematic outside of some of the best, most efficient pieces that I'm running.
So if you want to learn more about this template, head over to the website. You can also check out some of our past videos where we talk about it as well.
Yes, absolutely. So outside of vegetables, what is affecting your power level? One of the things that affects it pretty heavily is your strategy. Some strategies are just simply more powerful than others. So even if you attempt to build a lower power deck of a given commander or a given strategy, or even janky versions of it, it will simply just outperform the table because what it's doing is just more powerful or on a different axis than the table can interact with, and they're not going to be able to keep up.
Yeah, so we have found this. We've shared this story several times on the channel that we built these Is It Storm decks on a $25 budget, and they were capable of consistently winning between turns 3 and 5. And that is not something that you want to play at a lower power table, even if the cards are only, a sum of $25. That doesn't feel very good. Or we talked earlier this week in our bonus episode, we talked about Light Paws as an example of a commander that can just be very difficult to deal with at a lower power table.
Yeah, some of the things that tend to push up the power level deck are playing monocolored decks. Monocolored decks are very focused. They can play their card pool is somewhat limited because they're only playing cards of that color, and within a given theme, there's only so many cards, so you sometimes end up getting pushed up towards some of the more efficient effects, right?
Yep.
And they just synergize very well. The same could be said for typal synergies and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, your zombie deck, you have to be very careful of what effects you add in because it can just snowball very quickly into a higher power level.
Yeah, what we had found is in my zombie deck that I had said, well, this is lower power because a lot of my effects are thematic. It turns out in a zombie deck, when most of your effects are on zombies, that's also very good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that becomes a boon rather than a burden.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you do have to be judicious in the other powerful effects that you're including in your deck, or else it could push you up, or you could either consistently perform at a high power, which this one did end up doing, was just consistently performing at a higher power, or occasionally perform at a higher power if you draw some of those power level outliers.
Yep. Another thing that influences the power level of your deck is the threat levels. The threat levels that you decide to include in the level of the threats
Yes.
that you decide to include in your deck. We talked about how the different types of interaction you play need to scale with the threats that you see at a given power level. The flip side is also true. When you're building your deck, you should be including threats that match the power level of the other decks that you want to be playing with.
Yeah, your threats should be scaling with the power level that you're trying to play at. So at a low power, you're playing threats that are easier to interact with, typically. And at higher power, you're playing threats that are harder to interact with. You can read more about this on our website. We categorize them there. We categorize them into tiers, and it's based off of the time frame that you have to deal with it and the overall impact that it has. So things that are high threat level threats can end a game and require nearly immediate interaction on the stack or as soon as they hit the battlefield, whereas lower threat level threats are scary, but they don't need to be dealt with immediately, right? They're impending and spooky and still threats, good, but they're you can maybe let them sit for a minute.
Absolutely. And another thing to consider are the combos that your deck may contain. We definitely consider combos, big C combos, infinite combos, to be the highest threats a deck can play, and as such, we typically reserve those for higher power decks.
Yeah, so the power levels that you can expect to see combos in would be mid power, where you're going to be playing mostly incidental combos. You're not actively searching for those, and typically they're like 3 or more cards. I really, at least I do. I don't know about you, Kelson, but I really subscribe to Dylan from Play to Win's philosophy on casual combos. Is that typically. And these are all casual power levels, I should say. Their philosophy is that their scale probably ends at mid power on our scale because they like they play
like really casual games. Yeah.
They like really casual games. But three cards and 7 or more mana is his, and that's how I feel about combos at mid power. Whereas at high mid, you might be playing more efficient combos, and you might even be actively searching for them, but likely not tutoring for them.
Yeah, because tutoring just adds an extra level of redundancy, where at high power, you are running the most efficient combos within a given theme, and you're actively searching and tutoring for those and having that extra redundancy.
Yeah, and it should be said that you're typically trying to find combos that are still on theme, even in high power. We try to avoid things like Thoracle or like Lion's Eye Diamond, Underworld Breach, like type CEDH type lines, because our philosophy in casual is that it's mostly based around theme, not based around winning, right? We're winning
Yeah,
within
even
a
at
given
higher
theme.
power levels, like the combos that I have in my high power landfall deck still revolve around lands, even though they play colors that could just run other combos. I don't run those combos because that's not the theme or the whole purpose of the deck. I've built it around a commander that I think is very cool and a strategy that I think is very cool. So everything is trying to fit within that strategy.
Yeah, and I've done the same thing with my Garth One-Eye deck. Most of my combos are built around tapping and untapping, or blinking Garth to reset his triggers and stuff like that. And so,
Even though it's a 5-color deck and you could run every efficient combo in Magic.
yeah, I would have essentially just be making a bad CDH deck rather than a fun,
Yeah.
high-power casual deck, right? Built around a theme. Yeah. So we talked about tutors a little bit ago. Part of looking for your combos is using tutors, and that's because tutors are just super, super powerful, and they act as redundancy for effects in a deck, so they can find you a combo, or they just act as another copy of your value engine or the best card in your deck at any given moment. So if you're including a tutor, the question you have to ask yourself is, what are you tutoring for?
Yeah, are you just trying to look for a value piece, or are you looking for a combo? What are you searching for? How easily can you find it? And how does it affect the power level of your deck? Those are the questions that you need to be asking yourself. In general, we avoid tutors for low to mid power decks. We start to include them at high mid, like we mentioned before, but they're generally more narrow and are mostly searching for value engines. So they have some restrictions on them, some guardrails. At high power, we include all the tutors that search for anything, and those are usually searching for win conditions.
Yeah, because we're trying to play the highest power decks possible at that point. And just to reiterate, they're just so powerful. Like, I think we even saw a comment earlier, which I don't think is wrong. Like, they had said Vampiric Tutor is stronger in Legacy or Modern than it is in Standard. And I think that's true, because you're just playing, like, more powerful effects.
Sure.
And so the same could probably be said that a Vampiric Tutor is better in a high power deck than it is in a low power deck. But I think the counter to that is, well, it may not be looking for a combo, but Vampiric Tutor is just looking for Soul Ring in your
Sure.
low power deck. And so every start is now a Soul Ring start, as long as you draw one of those two.
Yeah, it's still giving you the advantage of the best card in your deck. It's just adding another copy of the best card in your deck. And people might say, I think we tried this for a little bit. We're like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll just play tutors, but I just won't search for combos or things like that. And sandbagging a tutor just feels really bad. Like we love the Sheldon Menery quote, build casually, play competitively. You should just play to win with whatever cards you have. Just don't put in cards in your deck that are going to be outside of the power level you're trying to play, because then you do have to sandbag, and sandbagging just feels really bad.
Yeah, one of the philosophies I heard a lot was that it's more fun to like draw into a combo than to tutor for it. I remember watching it was a Command Zone episode where they're talking about the things they don't play anymore, and a couple people mentioned tutors, and I didn't really understand why, because I was acquiring tutors at the time, and I never really played with tutors, and I was like, these are so cool. Why would you not play these? And now I think I've come around to understanding that they just warp the power level of the deck than most other cards will, because they're an initial copy of whatever the most powerful card is at any given moment.
Yep. So all of this comes together, all these things we talked about, into our 5 categories of power level. So we're going to do a quick review of each of those power levels, and then talk about a few other considerations beyond power level for building your decks. Let's talk about low power decks. Generally, where we start with low power decks is this is your average precon. We like to start our power level scale at precon, because that's kind of the bottom tier of what our playgroup plays, what we see a lot of people playing, and really the best way to introduce someone into Commander. So it's focused very much on casual and social gameplay. It's often more beginner friendly. And don't get us wrong, low power decks do not play bad cards by any means, but they are more optimized towards a theme, and in many cases sub-themes as well, than just pure efficiency.
Yeah, so to get those up to a low mid deck, typically what happens is you are taking these precons and you are removing some of the sub themes and some of the least efficient cards, right? You're building the Prosper precon, and you're saying out with the rat sub theme that has nothing to do with what this deck is trying to do, and instead you're adding vegetables. A lot of precon decks historically have not eaten their vegetables appropriately, so you're adding in vegetables and you're removing those sub themes and less efficient cards. So we're typically talking about these as fixed precons, like
Yeah, and you can still build to this power level. You don't have to like buy a precon and fix it if you want a low mid deck. But this is like a really good way to think about it and to picture what that looks like.
Yeah, you're not necessarily super optimized even within your theme. You're just eating your vegetables now, right?
Yeah, and then in mid power decks, these are now relatively optimized within a given theme. These are mostly playing efficient cards. There may still be some thematic cards. I think it's very fun in mid power decks to include those. There's a place for them. But in terms of vegetables, you're not playing all of the best versions of those effects or the best free effects. But you are playing really good ones. And you can also include some of those incidental combos that we were talking about. Like we said, some of those combos that Dylan likes to play where they're like 3 or more cards, a bunch of mana, and you aren't necessarily actively looking for those combos.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and then in high mid, we're still very optimized. I would argue that most decks between mid and high mid, the strategy is pretty equally optimized. Now we're just playing better cards. We're replacing some of the least efficient cards, some of the ones that we might have included just for fun thematic purposes or fun synergistic purposes.
Those are starting to fall off a little bit.
And we're playing, for card examples, things like Cyclonic Rift, right? This is where we start playing those really, like, the best versions of given effects, especially within your vegetables. You might be winning through combos, you might be playing some narrow tutors, but ultimately these are powerful strategies that are also now playing powerful cards.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And then when we talk about high power decks, the highest power decks within a given theme and generally some of the strongest strategies in casual Commander, these are using all of the best versions of vegetables available in all categories. And they're going to be playing broad and efficient tutors as redundancy for both win conditions, which are usually combos, and then also those really good early advantage pieces.
Yeah, so that is our quick summary of all of our power levels. If you want to learn more about them and even card examples of the type of cards you'd be playing in your vegetables or the type of combos you might be playing, check out commanderpowerlevels.com. That is, we're really excited about that, and that's the purpose of this episode is to kick that off.
Yeah. So a few other considerations to think about besides just power level. Being a responsible deck builder doesn't eliminate the need for having rule zero conversations, especially when you're playing outside of your regular play group, because not everyone is going to be as mindful as you are because you've adopted this system and you're building good decks.
Yeah, not everyone's as cool. Not everyone can be cool, but you guys are because you're adopting this system, right? Or wizard system when it eventually comes out. But it is good to know how to tease out the power level of someone's deck because you may not be working off the same system and still aren't, right? Like a lot of that's how it's been is people haven't been working off the same system. So questions like that people have traditionally asked, are you playing tutors? Are you playing free spells? How does your deck win? Is it winning through combos? Are you playing things like Cyclonic Rift, Superior's Protection, some signpost cards of like more powerful strategies? And what is the theme of your deck, right? And if they're like, I don't know, it's Dimir good stuff. And you're like, okay, sweet. Then I'm not gonna play. I'm not gonna play my squirrels deck.
Yeah, exactly. So we've also included some of these questions, some additional questions and tips for having these types of discussions on our site as well. If you want to see more ways that you can tease out those power level discussions in Rule Zero.
Yeah, go check it out. CommanderPowerLevels.com. We've not said it enough. Go check it out. Another thing that we like to consider outside of power levels are things like budget. We are generally proponents of proxies, but we understand that not everyone is really comfortable with that approach. They don't like proxies for one reason or another. And what that can result in is budget becoming a tangential discussion in Rule Zero conversations.
Yeah, because whether it's right or not, many people do tend to associate budget with power. Some expensive cards are very, very powerful, and others are really only powerful within a given strategy or theme. So there is a correlation there, but it can be a loose correlation. And we've just found that discussions around budget are best utilized in conjunction with power level, and also sometimes as constraints in the deck building process. We think it's really fun to build budget decks where we set a monetary limit for ourselves and then build to that limit, because it gives you another fun, creative constraint to work within.
Yeah, I think it's better to push that budget conversations to the beginning, right? If you're sitting down at a table and say, "Hey, what's the budget of your deck?" Like that tells you very little about how well that deck's going to do. I mean, clearly you can build very powerful budget decks. We were building $25 budget decks that were consistently winning between turn 3 and 5, right? Like there's a correlation, right? You're playing more powerful, more expensive cards. More powerful cards tend to be more expensive, right? But it's better if you then push that to the beginning and say, hey, we're deck building. I want to build to this power level, and I'm going to build within this budget. Does everyone feel cool with that? And then it's a more educational budget, right, than just pure numbers.
Honestly, I think, though, in the end, I think we prefer not to have those budgetary restrictions, which is one of the reasons that we have embraced proxying in our play group. Because if we are building to power levels correctly, we don't care about budget. The budget is not telling us anything definitive about the power level. If we're doing proper deck building practices that fit within a power level and let our decks perform consistently at a given power level, then who cares about budget? So that's another reason why we would ask you to strongly consider proxying.
Yeah. Yes. And also ask wizards to strongly consider not using budget as a basis for their bracketing reprints system. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, another thing we found about proxying, I'm going to show proxying some more. I've proxied 3 or 4 decks in the last month because I brewed them and I wanted to see how they played outside of goldfishing before I bought any of the cards for the decks. And some of them
because you do like buying the cards for your decks and owning those and having the physical copies of cards, and that's great, and that's a personal thing. But proxying allows you to test those decks before you make an investment. Because if you had bought all the cards for all 4 of those decks and then realized you didn't like playing one of them, that would have been sad.
Yeah, exactly. Or I might have owned 4 copies of Dockside Extortionist to put in each of my decks, right? Instead of proxying the one that I did have. So anyway, one other thing to consider here that we like to think about in conjunction with power level is the salt level of a deck. Some decks are just naturally more frustrating to play against, and that is something that comes down to player preference, right? I might be okay playing against stacks because I have played stacks or whatever, and I'm like, yeah, that's just part of the game. Some people may really hate it. It may really shut down their specific strategy, and that can just be unfun.
Yeah, it can be. So if there is a deck in your playgroup that is particularly unfun to play against, have a discussion about it. Talk about what makes it unfun. Maybe it just would belong better at a higher power level where decks are more ready and more equipped to deal with those salty threats, right?
Yeah, what we found is that post-game discussions are just as important as pre-game discussions in terms of like figuring out how Rule Zero is going to work. Rule Zero, I think we just equate with sitting down to play. What are you guys playing? And this is harder in LGS. I will cede that point, right? But if you're playing with a regular play group and you're having these type of feelings of like, hey, that deck sucks to play against. Like, why are you playing that? Like, post-game discussions will help you weed that sort of stuff out, and then maybe like take decks apart or figure out like what you would like to play instead.
Yeah, or power them up.
Or power them up. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with powering a deck up, and it's especially easy if you proxy. So consider it.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, like we mentioned earlier, we really think that the power levels discussions start with each individual player. It's our responsibility as a community to foster good power level discussions, but that really starts with intentionality in our deck building and trying to deck build to a power level.
Yeah, we recognize also that that's not something that appeals to every player, right? Some people just want to play the cards. They want to play their cards. They want to play the cool card that they just pulled from a Commander Masters pack, even though it's banned because it's Jeweled Lotus or whatever.
I have a Commander Masters pack sitting over there, and I'm so afraid to open it.
Oh my gosh! Hey, it's still. If you pull a Jeweled Lotus, it's all gravy, right? You're fine.
It's all gravy. Yeah,
you're
plus
chilling.
It's a cool card. It's sweet.
Yeah. I did see some people that pulled like frame break foil Jeweled
Textured
Lotuses.
Foil.
Yes, and they're like, of course I pull this like the day that it gets banned. But there are people that just want to slot the cards they're pulling into their decks, right? They're not proxying. They're saying, I pulled this sweet card. It wants to go on my deck. There's nothing wrong with that. Playing your cool new cards is super fun. We were doing that. We were buying cards, putting them in our decks. what we ask of you is that you do take a moment of introspection to think about how including those cards, which are likely power level outliers, in your decks is affecting the experience of your playgroup or the other people that you're playing with at an LGS.
Yeah, and you're still, as you play with strangers, as you go to your LGS, as you go to cons, you may still encounter people who are intentionally or deceitfully, or maybe they're just ignorant in Rule Zero conversations. And I think Gavin made a very good point on Twitter that there will always be bad actors, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and find a solution for the community at large with an assumption of good faith and good deck building and good Rule Zero discussions.
Yeah, I think that's been kind of a straw man argument that's been happening for this type of system in general. Is like people are just going to lie. It's like, okay, sure, like people will lie, but that's not the vast majority of the community. So many people are saying that people are going to lie that like it makes me believe that very few people are going to lie because so many people are like worried about this problem.
And that doesn't really work in your play group, does it? If you have a regular play group, because if someone's lying, you're like, "What do you play with us every week? What are you talking about? We know exactly what you're doing."
Yeah, you're looping extra turn spells. Like how is this a low power deck?
Oh my gosh, I love it. Well, we hope that this helped contribute to that conversation and provide a system, or at least even just some guidelines for how you can improve your deck building, how you can improve those power level and Rule Zero discussions. So please check out commanderpowerlevels.com. We'd really love to know what you think. You can let us know in the comments of this video. You can email us at show@thecommanderpod.com or at feedback@commanderpowerlevels.com.
Yes, everybody, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, remember to always pay the one.